In this clip we commence the discussion of the 10 most interesting stories from the life of St Francis of Assisi. 5 stories are addressed in this clip and a further 5 in clip number 5.2. The purpose of these clips is to assist with preparation for the Spiritist Meditation event being held on the feast of St Francis of Assisi at the Cottesloe Civic Centre in Perth, Australia on Sunday the 4th of October 2015. During Francis's life, Italy was not a unified country, but composed of a number of city-states that were either independent dukedoms or controlled by the papacy or the emperor. The emperor at the time was Frederick II, who'd been born in Assisi's castle. During Francis's time, Assisi was an imperial city under the rule of the emperor, whereas nearby Perugia was under papal control. It was a period of frequent feuds and wars. When Francis was 16, the people of Assisi laid siege on the castle of the emperor at the hilltop of the town. The Pope, Innocent III, used this opportunity to try to return Assisi to papal control. This caused civil war and damage to property and plunder, and some families, such as St Clare's, moved to Perugia. The move enabled Perusians to assert taxes over land in Assisi and demands for payments for damages. At the age of 20, Francis took part in a battle between Assisi and Perugia. He was eager for combat but unprepared for the slaughter and the massacre that he witnessed. There were few survivors, and those who survived, like Francis, were placed in dungeons in Perugia, and here he was imprisoned for about a year. It took Francis a further 3 years and many false starts to give up his desire for chivalrous glory. In 1205, Francis planned to accompany the Norman knight and conqueror Gautier de Brienne on his quest through Italy. On the first day of setting out, Francis gave his cloak and some weapons to a fallen knight that he passed on the road. Francis only got as far as Spoleto, about 50 kilometres from Assisi, when he became ill and in a dream was asked, "Who can give you more, the master or the servant?" He answered the master, and so was told intuitively to return home, where he would gain further instruction. I find the stories of Francis's soldiering a strong contrast with the peace-loving troubadour of popular legend, and a complete understanding of him really does require acknowledgement of this early phase of his life. The photo on the screen is a bronze sculpture of Francis returning to Assisi. The church in the background is the Basilica of St Francis. Leprosy was rife during the time of St Francis, and lepers lived just outside the limits of Assisi. Leprosy is a chronic, progressive, bacterial infection affecting the nerves of the extremities, the lining of the nose, the upper respiratory tract, and the eye. It causes skin sores, nerve damage, and muscle weakness. The bacteria was discovered in 1873, but the mode of transmission of leprosy is still unknown. In the Middle Ages, the disease was believed to be caused by sin. Lepers had to wear grey cloaks, and they had to ring bells to warn others of their approach. St Francis tells us that his conversion was due to his work with the lepers. Lepers made him shudder, but he came to the realization that his salvation was in loving what he had previously despised. Lepers, that's what I hate. I can't bear the sight of them. Even when I'm far away from them, just hearing the bells they wear to warn passers-by to keep their distance is enough to make me faint. God forgive me, but there is nothing in the whole world that disgusts me more than lepers. So said Francis in Nikos Kazantzakis' story, God's Pauper, St Francis of Assisi. The bells could be heard, now just behind the trees. The leper emerged from the clump of trees. In his hand he held a staff covered with bells which, as he shook the staff, warned passers-by to flee. As soon as he saw Francis running toward him with outstretched arms, he uttered a shrill cry, apparently from fright, and he halted, his knees giving way beneath him as though a sudden exhaustion prevented him from continuing. Half of his putrescent nose had fallen away. His hands were without fingers, they were just stumps, and his lips were an oozing wound. Throwing himself upon the leper, Francis embraced him, then lowered his head and kissed him upon the lips. Afterward he lifted him in his arms, and covering him with his robe, he began to advance slowly with heavy steps toward the city. He walked and walked, and the city suddenly loomed before us. Suddenly, Francis stopped abruptly. He bent down and drew aside the robe of the leper in order to uncover him. But all at once he uttered a loud cry. The robe was empty. Francis could not speak, but his face was resplendent, ablaze. The tears flowing from his eyes, he fell prostrate to the ground and began to kiss the soil. It wasn't a leper. It was Christ himself who had come down to earth in the form of a leper in order to test Francis. Lady Poverty was Francis's personal spiritual love. During his lifetime, money of a medium of exchange had just been reintroduced. It was considered the essence of all values, a thing which everybody sought to acquire and accumulate. But Francis wasn't interested in it. As a young man, he gave it away and he spent it on others. Later, he only wanted to live the gospel and to be attached to things of heaven. With Lady Poverty, he totally surrendered worldly goods, honours and privileges for her. The image on the screen comes from the film Brother Sun, Sister Moon. It's the culmination of a shocking scene where, following a very public adjudication of an action brought by his father, Francis completely undresses himself and returns all of his clothing and possessions to his earthly father, trusting in the providence of God alone. The bishop who's adjudicating the matter is deeply touched by Francis's piety, and he wraps the naked youth in a cloak. The symbolism is clear. The cloak of the church is now his protection. In a Franciscan book written a year after the death of Francis, Lady Poverty is present in the Garden of Eden before the fall. For possessing nothing, he belonged entirely to God. Francis said that Lady Poverty was inspired by a passage from the Gospel, and there are 3 passages, 2 from Matthew and 1 from Luke, that are frequently used to explain Francis' position on this issue. Francis believed that property aroused envy and conflict, and it was the most destructive thing to peace in the world, because it required arms to defend it. Early Franciscans lived as completely as possible without poverty. Friars could accept payment of bread and fruit for their labour, but they were not allowed to have money or real estate, nor could they in any way save up for the next day. Francis's position was radical, and there was resistance to it within the church and later within the order. Against Francis's will, the order's rule regarding ownership of property was revised, and this led to Francis resigning as leader. Pope Innocent III reigned from January 1198 to his death in 1216. He was the Pope who approved preaching by Franciscans in 1210 after having a dream in which he saw St Francis holding up the Lateran Church. As Pope, he called for Christian crusades against Muslim Spain and the Holy Land, as well as against the Cathars in southern France. Innocent was one of the most powerful and influential popes, and arguably the most powerful European in his day. He exerted a wide influence over Christian regimes in Europe, claiming supremacy over all of Europe's Christian kings. Surprisingly, I was unable to find any paintings of the death of Innocent III. This image shows the rule of Francis being approved by Pope Innocent, but the story that I want to share relates to 1216. Francis heard that Innocent was in Perugia in his palace, and he set off there to plead for some changes to the rules regarding indulgences. When Francis arrived in Perugia, he was told that Innocent was dying. The Curia, the members of the religious surrounding the Pope, were not with him. They were in the antechamber to Innocent's room. He was alone, and the reason for this was that there was this belief that Innocent had the plague. There were doctors with him, but no members of the church. Francis notoriously said that doctors of the soul were more useful at this time than doctors of the flesh, and he went in and sat with Innocent. He said a prayer for him, and the Pope was said to be grateful for this. The Pope passed later in the day, and his unguarded dead body was left in the style of the time overnight. there were no guards watching him because the soldiers were concerned that they would pick up the plague from being near him. And while he was unattended, the Pope was robbed, his clothing was taken, and his jewellery. Francis hears of this, and he goes to the Pope and gives his own robe to the Pope, covers his body with that. And the Pope was buried in Francis's robe. Francis made 3 attempts to preach to the Muslims. In 1212, he was shipwrecked trying to get to the Holy Land. In 1214, an illness ends his trip to try and convert the Moors in Spain. And in 1219, during the 5th Crusade, he finally travels to Egypt, with him brother Illuminato. The reason for going to Egypt is to preach to the Sultan, Malik al-Kamil. He actually spends 3 weeks there, and we do not know what it was that he said to the Sultan, or exactly what his objective was. We can speculate that he was seeking to convert the Sultan, perhaps he was seeking martyrdom, perhaps he was seeking peace. But what was actually said is not known. There are some who believe that the Sultan was a member of the Sufi Brotherhood, which emphasized union with Allah through love. And if this was the case, he may well have been a mystic too. Regardless of what was said, the Sultan was pleased with Francis because he asked him to stay, and we're told that Francis said he would stay if the Sultan converted, and the Sultan said that no matter how beautiful the Christian religion was, he could not convert. Francis left, respectful of the Muslims. He was particularly impressed with the call to prayer and encouraged Christians to emulate the Muslims in prayer and prostration, and to follow the Muslims' example of being in service to all people despite different religions. The Sultan gave Francis permission to visit the holy places in Palestine, and he went to Jerusalem and to Nazareth and to Bethlehem. And very interestingly, there's been an ongoing Franciscan presence in the Holy Land since around this time. While I don't know that you can say for certain, it's very interesting to note that 10 years after Francis met with the Sultan, the holy places in Jerusalem and Bethlehem were ceded to the Christians. This is part 1 of the 5th in a series of clips aimed at providing some background about St Francis ahead of our meditation day at the Cottesloe Civic Centre in Perth, Australia on Sunday the 4th of October 2015. If you'd like to join us for this meditation, we would really welcome that, but you must register online if you wish to attend, as space is limited.